Big developments this week in Alberta regarding the push for a referendum on separation. Prime Minister Mark Carney has announced a major shift in Canada's Israel-Palestine policy. Plus, a major backlog of passenger complaints has swamped the Canadian Transportation Agency. All that and more straight ahead on episode 21 of the Rob Breakenridge Show. Well, greetings, friends, and welcome to this episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show. Lots to get into, a very busy week as July draws to a close, and who knows what awaits us once we get into August. Let's start with the news this week in Alberta, and a couple of big developments this week regarding the dueling efforts to ask Albertans directly about our future in Canada. Now, both of these developments concern the role of Alberta's chief electoral officer in this whole process, and two key decisions he announced this week. Gordon McClure has given the green light to a group led by former MLA and Cabinet Minister Thomas Lukaszuk. We'll hear from Thomas in just a second. His group is fighting for Canada and fighting against the separatists. So they're looking to beat the separatists at their own game, and it is indeed their petition that has been approved first. But they face a steep hill to climb in the number of signatures they need to gather and the time they have to do it. Meanwhile, there's the other petition effort that's been organized by the separatist Alberta Prosperity Project. Now, their proposal is a constitutional question. They're proposing that a referendum be worded as such, quote, "Do you agree that the province of Alberta shall become a sovereign country and cease to be a province in Canada?" Now, because Alberta's Citizens Initiative law mandates that unconstitutional questions cannot be put to a referendum, and because the legislation allows the chief electoral officer to refer a matter to court, that's exactly what McClure is doing. He has decided to refer this to the Court of King's Bench, noting the need to ensure that the proposal conforms with the requirements of Alberta's law. It's possible the court could reject the question altogether, which would be most interesting. That uncertainty, plus the delay this process creates, has not gone over well with the separatists. And clearly the Premier is worried about what might happen to her if her government is seen as antagonizing or blocking the separatists. So this week, both the Premier and the Justice Minister took to social media calling on the Chief Electoral Officer to withdraw his court reference. Now, fortunately, McClure is resisting this pressure, noting that his office is an independent agency. But really, he's just following the law as this government wrote it. It's highly unusual for a government to draft and pass a law and then ask for it to be disregarded. If the Premier and the Justice Minister are worried about the democratic process, well, we now have a petition that's been approved. If it gathers enough signatures, we could have a referendum. That's direct democracy in action. So let's talk about this week's developments and where things go from here. Thomas Lukaszuk is a former Alberta MLA and Deputy Premier. He is the founder of this group, which I believe is still called Forever Canadian, although the news release from the Chief Electoral Officer calls it Alberta Forever Canada. Thomas, thanks for joining us here. Welcome to the program.
Hi there, Rob. Thank you for having me. By the way, if you don't mind, I'll correct. It's Forever Canadian Group.
Forever Canadian. Okay, so the release from the Chief Electoral Officer makes reference to Alberta Forever Canada. So what's
probably error on the side of Elections Alberta. But I'll tell you one thing. I am not surprised because they have been doing an incredible job. Just so everybody appreciates what it took. No other province in Canada has ever had a citizens' initiative legislation. It was just brought in recently by Jason Kenney. So, and it never has been used in Alberta. So there's no precedent. So Elections Alberta had 30 days to put together the entire procedure and everything in order for us to be able to go ahead. So if they slipped up on a part of the name, they have my forgiveness.
So let's talk about this decision. So you submitted the petition to the Chief Electoral Officer. What needed to happen now leading up to this announcement today?
Okay, so the commissioner had 30 days to make a determination whether my question meets a variety of legislative requirements. The most important being the reference case in Quebec, which is a Supreme Court of Canada decision, then our Canadian Constitution, and all provincial legislation. And our commissioner has determined in those 30 days that yes, our question complies with all those legal requirements. It is clear. It isn't, confusing to a potential reader, and it asks for a yes or no answer. So we have fulfilled those requirements. So now, as of today, we have been approved. But in the meantime, also Elections Alberta has been putting together all the rules, what the petition is going to look like, how it's going to be handled, how are we going to transmit data and information, how will it be delivered back, how will the people who will be collecting, our volunteers who will be collecting the signatures, how will they be credentialed? So there was, while Elections Alberta was building their airplane while flying it, we were building our airplane while flying it. But I would say our job was even a little bit more difficult because Elections Alberta was creating the rules, yet we were building a campaign not exactly knowing what the rules will be. So we had to build our campaign in 30 days.
I guess adding to this is the fact that, we've got rules that apply to referendums on policy questions and rules that apply if it's a constitutional question. And the separatist group, the Alberta Prosperity Project, they've submitted a petition on a constitutional question. So the chief electoral officer is referring that to court. And as you saw, that got some pushback from the premier and the justice minister. But your question is different then in that sense.
Yes. Well, the proponents of the other question, especially the lawyers in that group, should know that you cannot ask an unconstitutional question. You cannot ask government to break the law, to break the Constitution. And as such, this constitutional amendment that they're asking for cannot be done because, number one, it disrespects all treaties that our First Nations have signed, not with Ottawa, but with Buckingham Palace. So pushing forward a referendum that totally disregards the treaties in itself is a problem. And the question, the way it's structured, also has a problem. It's not a clear yes or no question. So they have a variety of problems, but we'll let them worry about that. We met all the legislative requirements. Now, you bring up a good point. The premier first created two sets of rules, one for separatists, one for us. We have to run twice around the field to race them. They only have to run once around the field, and we still have to win, but that's fine. If it was the separatist question, they would have to collect half the signatures in twice the time and have a very much relaxed rules for fundraising. But, it is what it is. The premier is trying to tilt the field any way possible to help the separatist movement. Yesterday, she actually even took an unprecedented step where a premier of a province is telling Elections Alberta what to do, an independent officer. I will be wondering how the next elections in Alberta will be run when it is actually the premier who's telling Elections Alberta, who organize elections, what to do. And she's also interfering with courts. But that's just noise. We now have, even though we haven't launched our campaign, over 3,000 volunteers. We have to get them all registered with Elections Alberta, and there will be thousands more. We have to get those petitions into their hands, and they will be hitting rodeos and farmers markets and door knocking on your door and showing up wherever possible to collect the number of signatures that we are required to collect. And we will do it.
Yeah, it's interesting, as you know. The chief electoral officer, this is all new, and they're doing their best to make sure that they're doing everything right. So in the case this week where the law says a question cannot contradict the Constitution, the chief electoral officer should get clarity from the court. You've got the chief electoral officer following the law, and then you've got the premier and the justice minister kind of telling him that he shouldn't.
Well, what they really are doing, and I'm expecting some lawyer, I don't have time to do this now. Some lawyer should actually file complaints in court and charges, because the justice minister right now and the premier are counseling Elections Alberta to commit a crime, to break a law, not to follow a statute which dictates how they do their work. For some it's difficult to understand because this is sort of inside baseball politics, but the organization that sets up all elections in Alberta to make sure that they're fair and independent, and they manage referendums like this one and petitions, they are 100% independent of government, of the premier. They only report to the Alberta legislature, to all MLAs in the legislature. They're 100% independent of government, just like our courts are 100% independent of government. For a premier to step in and say, Mr. Commissioner, I am not happy with your decision. I want you to reverse your decision, and I want you to allow separatists to have their application go forward as well, does two things. She is interfering in independent offices, and that opposition should be calling for her to step down because of that. But the second thing is, now she finally came out and told us which side she's on. She now is compelling Elections Alberta to allow the separatist petition to go forward. So she no longer can say that she is pro-unity, pro-Canada, if she is now willing to break the law to make sure that separatists have their shot at it, and they won't.
At the same time, I mean, the Premier could just call a referendum herself if she thinks the question should be framed a certain way, or if she likes the question the separatists are putting forward. Are you worried that that could actually happen, that the Premier could somehow short-circuit this whole process?
No, because my question still goes forward. There is nothing that the Premier can do to my process. Elections Alberta is independent. They ratified this process, and we're going forward. The Premier can call an election. She can have 5 of her own question. My question is still going forward, and she will have to deal with it. You know, we live in a democracy, and premiers are not omnipotent. This is not a dictatorship. She simply has to work within the rules that govern what premiers can and cannot do. The fact is, yes, she can have her own referendum, but you know, her number one priority right now is to remain being premier, to stay in power. She has caucus members who are pro-separatist. So she's walking this sort of fine line between those in caucus who are pro-Canada and those who are not. And she's trying to satisfy them both. And, you know, Rob, we all know, not only in politics, but in life, if you try to please everybody, you end up pleasing nobody. And I think that's where she's heading.
So let's remind people then what your question would state. How have you designed it?
Should Alberta remain in Canada? It's just that simple. And the answer is yes, of course.
So yes is to stay, whereas the separatist question would be yes to leave.
To leave. And they were building their campaign for over a year and a half, asking their supporters to vote yes. But now yes means actually staying in Canada. Mm-hmm.
And so let's talk about the process now. So Elections Alberta has now triggered this process, and now I guess the clock is ticking. What needs to happen here?
Yes, so we will be having a brief meeting with Elections Alberta, hopefully today or tomorrow, to just go over the rules and make sure that we clearly understand each other, as there's no precedence. Nobody has ever done this before. And then shortly after, within a day or two, we will be launching our campaign, which means we need anybody, and we need thousands more people, volunteers who are willing to collect the signatures to register on our website. Rob, if you don't mind, I'll repeat it. It's forever-canadian.ca. And then we will register those canvassers with Elections Alberta. They will be approved by Elections Alberta, and then Elections Alberta will mail them their credentials. So they will get a badge and everything. So when they're collecting signatures, everybody will know that those are the official signature collectors for Elections Alberta.
And so October 28th is the deadline, as you understand it then?
That is correct. That is correct. So we have 90 days to collect nearly 300,000 signatures. It's a massive task. It's never been done before.
Oh, sure.
But looking at the response that we are receiving, you know, we haven't even launched the campaign, and we have over 3,000 already eager volunteers to do the work. I'm very positive that we will not only reach that number and exceed that number. You know, vast majority of Albertans, and when I say vast, I'm talking 80% here, want nothing to do with separation. As a matter of fact, rightfully so, they fear that this whole talk about separation is going to cause us irreparable damage, economic damage, because investment and businesses don't do well when there is political instability. So the moment we get the signatures, we'll put this behind us, and then separatists cannot file another petition for another 5 years. So we'll have some breathing room.
So we talked about last time. So the Premier has lowered the threshold in terms of the number of signatures needed for a referendum, but that came into force just as you had submitted your petition. So if, for example, the separatists get the go-ahead, they'll only have to collect, I believe it's 177,000 signatures. That's right. Is that right?
So the Premier, you know, played a game, and we need to call her out on it. She passed the legislation, the amendment, a long time ago, and she sat on it. And then she proclaimed, which means brought into force, the entire act with the exception of the date when the rules changed. That's the only thing she held back. And she waited till American Independence Day. They had an agreement with separatists that separatists will file, and she will immediately trigger the new rules for them. So as I said earlier, she would allow them. If I was a separatist, I would have to collect half the signatures in nearly twice the time, and the restrictions on fundraising would be minor compared to what we have. But that's fine. The Premier has identified whom she wants to help, where her allegiances lie. But we don't mind doing the heavy lifting. There are more than 300,000 Albertans who are committed to Canada. And the stories, Rob, that I'm hearing right now, people. I don't know how some people got my phone number, but I'm getting phone calls and I'm getting tons of direct messages and emails. And, elderly people crying because someone in their family a long time ago died in a war, wearing a Canadian uniform, about the people being in civil service the entire life and working for Canada, refugees and immigrants that, they owe literally their lives to Canada. The stories are really, heartbreaking. Canadians love Canada and Albertans are Canadians.
You would hope, though, maybe that Elections Alberta would apply the new rules to your petitions. So why do you think that didn't happen? And is that already decided? Is there any chance to revisit that?
Well, because unlike the Premier, Elections Alberta is not going to break the law. The Premier hold on just to that one aspect of the act, the change of rules, and implemented it purposely just after I filed my petition. And she knew I had to file it before the separatists, or the separatist petition would go forward. So, it was she forces us to enter a fight with one hand tied behind our back, but that's fine. That's what she chooses to do, and I hope, or I think, that Albertans will judge her accordingly at election time. But Elections Alberta put the rules actually based on the act. Now, we think that there could be a possible judicial challenge of whether the old or newer rules should apply to us. But Rob, we have 90 days. We're laser focused on collecting signatures. But our lawyers, just so you know, our lawyers are reviewing that. Because it's simply patently unfair. Everybody who looks at the situation knows that the field has been tilted; it's skewed towards separatists. But you know what? Not everything in life is easy. Some people have to fight harder for the same outcome, and we will simply do that.
Yeah. And again, so folks know, and the way the rules are written, that if this petition succeeds, and this is the question that gets put to Albertans, that's it. There can't be another petition. There can't be another referendum on the same issue.
Correct. And the Premier, by the way, at the end has an option. There doesn't have to be a referendum. Because of the fact that we are applying under the policy directive, the Premier simply can bring a vote to the legislature where all MLAs will get to vote on adopting anti-separatist policies, which means that there is a number of pieces of legislation, the Alberta Sovereignty Act and others, that she would have to pull back on and adopt, like she should, a pro-Canadian approach to governing our province. So she has that choice, but I don't anticipate that she will do that, having at least 14 MLAs and half of them cabinet ministers who are pro-separatist and who would actually vote against that. So, her main goal right now is to keep her caucus united, because if they split, she loses the next election. And she will do everything in her power to keep both sides happy.
Yeah, and she is worried about the split, and she has said as much publicly. So I think there's a lot there.
But Rob, what's disheartening?
Yeah.
Sorry for interjecting, but
Go ahead.
What really is not only disheartening but troubling is that we have a Minister of Justice who's a lawyer, a member of the Law Society, mind you, a junior lawyer at best, but is a justice minister after all. For him to actually come out with the Premier and direct an independent officer of legislature to withdraw documents from court and allow the separatist petition to go forward, that may be worthy of a disbarment from the Law Society, because you cannot have lawyers counseling anyone to not follow the law.
So it would be up to the Premier, though, to decide, as you say, if there's going to be a referendum, and then I guess when there would be a referendum.
So Elections Alberta will dictate that as well. So, thank God we live in a country where premiers unilaterally don't run this province. Elections Alberta will compel her to attach this referendum question to the next election, either municipal or provincial. So she will have no choice on that. She could call a separate referendum just for that question, but I wouldn't want her to do that, because that would be extremely expensive. What I would hope is that we don't actually have a referendum, that the Premier adopts pro-Canada policy and stops this nonsense with separation. And our petition actually allows for that to happen.
Well, it's an interesting point because I do wonder if the separatists are being stymied in their efforts, what if they throw their efforts behind you and say, well, a referendum on this question is better than no referendum. Let's support Thomas Lukaszuk and let's have it out.
Sure. No, yeah, they can do that, and I'm just fine with that. But be it known, and you will see it by the numbers of signatures that we're getting and the response we're getting, that if there was a referendum, 80% of voters will vote in favor of staying in Canada. Rob, the way we see it now, and we are using a lot of IT right now, sort of, dealing with data and looking at what's going on. About 10% of Albertans actually want separation. They would sign on a dotted line today. Most of them would like to join the United States. There is another 10% that are sort of intrigued by the idea, and they say, interesting. Maybe we should use it as a leverage, but are not committed to the idea, but are willing to entertain it. The remaining 80% of Albertans want nothing to do with it. Does it mean that they're happy with status quo, that they love Ottawa and they love the federal government and they love the way we get along with other provinces? No. But they are rational enough to know that there are processes to resolve those problems. And actually part of being Canadian is having those problems. We have a country where there is continuous push and pull between provinces. That's what makes us work as well as relatively compared to other countries we work. But they want nothing to do with separation. They love our maple leaf flag. They're proud Canadians. And they're smart enough to know that the whole idea of Alberta being a separate country, landlocked country, is simply not making any sense.
Okay, so the process now to gather these signatures, and I mean, mention the website forever-canadian.ca, but just so people know, this is not a website for gathering signatures. This all has to be done in person, actual signatures, verified. There's a lot to this.
Yeah, well, the process is archaic, and I will have that discussion with Elections Alberta, but, we can't change it. It is what it is. But yeah, it's the good old pen and paper. Each page only has 6 signatures. So imagine 300,000 signatures, and each page only has 6. Canada Post being used. I will have to actually physically deliver, I imagine, a massive U-Haul worth of petitions. So it's sort of done the way things used to be done, but that's the way this legislation is drafted. And what's funny is this is actually a pretty new piece of legislation. Jason Kenney brought it into force when he was being pushed against vaccinations and masks and everything else. He says, well, if you want to create your own law, here's a legislation, create your own law. And it wasn't used until I used it for our first time. I don't think Jason Kenney intended for that petition to be used that way.
Well, although, at the same time, Jason Kenney, I think, is going to be a strong voice for Canada once we get to that point. So I think that's important that there are those champions.
And you know what? And this is sort of the beautiful thing about this process. I wish this process didn't have to happen. I wish no one in Canada would be discussing separatism. But since we are forced into this process is actually bringing all of us together. On our team, and we have a pretty robust team of sort of leaders in this. We have Liberals, we have NDP, we have Labour Movement, we have Conservatives, and we have ultra Conservatives. We have the old Reformers working with us. And I know that Premier Jason Kenney just indicated a willingness to work with us as well. Lukaszuk and Kenney are like oil and water. We never mix together. And on this issue, I will be proud to stand next to him at the same podium and say, yes, we don't agree politically on many things, but we are Canadians, and we will die in trenches for Canada together.
Yeah. All right. So as noted, for now, Elections Alberta is referring to it as Alberta Forever Canada. It is Forever Canadian, as you've clarified, forever-canadian.ca, and there'll be more information coming about how people can volunteer and where they can go to get their signatures down.
That's right. On that website, you can already register as a volunteer, or if you want to donate money. This process, unfortunately, is expensive as well, the logistics of it. So you can do that right now. But once we unveil unveil the campaign within the next literally few days. The whole website will be robust. We will be answering most questions. We will be actually in real time answering questions, because I'm sure a lot of Albertans will have a lot of questions, because we've never done this before in Canada. So we are prepared for all that. But now, Rob, to finish off, we live in an amazing country. And this country seldom asks anything of us, but it gives us a lot by way of opportunities compared to anywhere else in the world. For our first time in Alberta, we have an existential crisis. And now, as much as we say we love Canada and we're proud of being Canadian, now is the time to put your pen to paper and actually sign on the dotted line. Because if we don't, who knows what this new Canada is going to look like.
All right. Well, much more still to come. Again, forever-canadian.ca. Thomas Lukaszuk, appreciate the update and the overview. Thanks so much for making some time for us here.
Thank you, Rob. I really appreciate it.
Right, there you go. Once again, that is Thomas Lukaszuk, former Alberta PC MLA, former cabinet minister, including deputy premier, and he is one of the founders of this group, Forever Canadian, forever-canadian.ca. So, yeah, I'm not sure why the chief electoral officer called them Alberta Forever Canada, but it is kind of a moot point. The petition has been approved, and these efforts can now begin. What's interesting to see this week, the endorsement of the Forever Canadian effort by former Premier Ed Stelmach. So I'll be curious as this issue moves forward, or this debate moves forward, what other prominent political leaders get involved, and get involved in what way. So we'll see where this all goes from here. But yeah, just under 300,000 signatures by October 28th. That is going to be a mammoth effort. So I'll be curious to see if they can pull it off, or if not, how close they come. Because depending how things play out, the separatist efforts might then operate under that lower threshold and only need about, I think, 177,000 signatures. So are we going to get a referendum on this question? I mean, it still feels like it's trending in that direction, but some developments this week, I guess, that maybe add to some of the uncertainty as to how this is all going to play out in the end. So we'll continue to follow that. Coming up in just a moment, we'll talk about the big news this week out of Ottawa, the announcement by Prime Minister Mark Carney that Canada is going to change its position on the Israel-Palestine question. Canada is prepared now, coming up in September at the UN, to recognize a Palestinian state. Now, this is a departure from our previous policy, which has always been rooted in a two-state solution. But there's no peace agreement here. There's no agreement to move forward on two separate states. Canada is going to sort of preemptively recognize a Palestinian state. Now, this comes on the heels of Britain and France announcing the same, but it does clash with U.S. policy, even though Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu seem to be in disagreement on some important issues. And it's being rejected, as you might imagine, by Israel's government. So we'll talk a bit more about the announcement, the implications, some of the reaction here at home. You're listening to The Rob Breakenridge Show. All right, welcome back. Well, a major foreign policy announcement Wednesday from Prime Minister Mark Carney, as he announced Canada will follow the lead of France and the UK and officially recognize a Palestinian state.
For the reasons I cited earlier, Canada intends to recognize the state of Palestine at the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly in September 2025. This intention is predicated on the Palestinian Authority's commitment to much-needed reforms, including commitments by the Palestinian Authority's President Abbas to fundamentally reform its governance, to hold general elections in 2026 in which Hamas can play no part, and to demilitarize the Palestinian state. Canada will increase its efforts in supporting strong democratic governance in Palestine and the contributions of its people to a more peaceful and hopeful future. I spoke today with President Abbas at length to reaffirm his commitments. Canada reiterates that Hamas must immediately release all hostages taken in the horrific terrorist attack of October 7th, that Hamas must disarm, and that Hamas must play no role in the future governance of Palestine.
Okay, so look, it's all well and good to demand all of that of Hamas, but I mean, Thursday was being reported that Hamas had withdrawn from ceasefire talks. So it doesn't appear as though they're prepared to lay down their arms or release the remaining hostages anytime soon. Look, there is obviously growing and understandable concern about the humanitarian crisis that's unfolding in Gaza, all kinds of questions about the future of Gaza and who will be in charge in Gaza. There are the far-right politicians in the coalition of Israel's prime minister that have talked about taking over Gaza, and there are very valid questions about Benjamin Netanyahu's own strategy. Public opinion polls show Netanyahu continuing to lose support among Israeli voters. But what does Canada think this is going to accomplish? I think there is a very valid concern here about the message this sends, since we're recognizing a Palestinian state as a result of the war that Hamas started on October 7th, 2023. That doesn't seem right. Carney was asked Wednesday about the fact that neither Israel nor Hamas seem too interested in Canada's new position or the conditions that Canada has laid out.
It's not been clear, say, in the last 48 hours that either the Netanyahu government or Hamas is at all interested in these conditions. And so who's going to make them?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. Hamas is not welcome in any way, shape, or form. So, of course, and one of the issues is not to give Hamas in any way, shape, or form a veto over a process that affects both the Israeli and Palestinian people. I could say much harsher things, and I should say much harsher things about Hamas, but that's a basic structural point. There are some in positions of influence in the state of Israel that do not want a two-state solution, that are taking actions to frustrate that actively. And we are part of a growing and very significant international community that is leaning against that, that is prioritizing the possibility and the prospect for a two-state solution. There are other measures that can be taken. For now, what we're doing is to promote a positive process towards peace.
And there's also the question about conditions versus expectations. Obviously, the steps Carney has talked about aren't going to happen between now and September. Other steps, like Hamas laying down its arms or releasing the hostages, very well could happen. It could happen tomorrow in theory. So maybe Canada could change course again in the coming weeks, but at the same time, this announcement seems pretty definitive. Well, joining us now for more on the Prime Minister's announcement, what the concerns are about this change in direction, what the implications could be, is Stacey Leavitt Wright. She is CEO of the Jewish Federation of Edmonton, more jewishedmonton.org. Stacey, so good to have you with us here. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for inviting me.
So as mentioned, Canada's position has long been wanting to see a two-state solution here. But how much of a departure, though, is this new position from that previous policy?
This position is a departure because they did not make statehood recognition contingent on the removal of Hamas from Gaza and the return of Israeli hostages. So they are very much still separated.
It's interesting because, and some reporters are kind of parsing the Prime Minister's language. He talks about predicated versus conditions. I think it's reasonable for Canada to say that Hamas should disarm, Hamas should release the hostages, Hamas should play no role in governing Gaza or any Palestinian territory. But that's all not going, none of that's going to happen within the next month or so. So we're going to make the recognition, sort of hoping or assuming that happens, I guess.
Exactly. And that really is the crux of it, is that we're still not demanding that from Hamas and making those demands really what should be happening before the Palestinian state is established. The Prime Minister has recognized the state based on some misguided or very vague commitments by the Palestinian Authority. And so there's a lot of concern about that as well. President Mahmoud Abbas does not have a strong record of democratic intentions. He's a Holocaust denier as well. He funds terrorism and rewards those activities. So there's a lot of concern about what these demands are and predications are.
The thing is, even though the Prime Minister says we won't recognize Hamas or we don't want Hamas to play any role in governing a Palestinian state, it was the attack by Hamas that has sort of got us to this point. I think the counterfactual where Hamas have not carried out the attacks of October 7th, we wouldn't be recognizing a Palestinian state. So does it still, in a way, almost reward those actions?
I think you've hit the nail on the head, and that's what one of the reasons this is smarting so hard for the Canadian Jewish community is it seems like we are rewarding them for these terrorist actions. And there were Canadians who were murdered that day and who were taken hostage that day. And for those families as well, this for all Jewish Canadians, it seems like we are rewarding Hamas for taking part in this and initiating this.
As mentioned, I mean, there's certainly concern about the humanitarian situation in Gaza, the impact that this conflict is having, a conflict that we should note was started by Hamas. What would be a more productive way, do you think, though, for Canada to try to address some of those concerns?
I think Canada should be putting pressure on the UN right now and should be putting pressure on the states that are rewarding Hamas and funding Hamas. Qatar could be one of those that are allowing them to continue as they are. And I think the pressure should be on Hamas to ensure that the aid does go through. It's not looted. People aren't being shot at for going to try and get at that aid. So these are big issues.
In terms of Canada's relationship with Israel, and I mean, you know, we're both democracies. We're going to have different governments that are not going to see eye to eye on issues. So, you know, the relationship matters, even if there's disagreements. And clearly there are right now. There's some disagreements with the Netanyahu government or concern about certain elements in the government and their approach to Gaza. I mean, I guess this is meant to try to put pressure on the government of Israel to change course here. But, I mean, how should friends and allies be dealing with each other? Not like this, I wouldn't imagine.
It doesn't feel like Canada's treating Israel like an ally right now. That's what I would say to that. This is not how one treats an ally who has gone through and is under very severe threat from 7 fronts, you would say, at the same time. And so there's stronger action that Canada can take to show and demonstrate that support for Israel right now as its democratic ally in the Middle East.
So what do you fear the implications could be now moving forwards resulting from this decision, both abroad and here at home?
Here at home, there are implications that we are very concerned about and prepare for as a Jewish community. One being the emboldening of those who agree with this position, who think that it allows them to take further, stronger action on our streets and with our institutions. We've seen a spike in anti-Semitism over the last 2 years. It's no surprise, and here in Edmonton as well. So we're concerned about how that might impact some of the security issues that we face as a community.
Now, there's still time, I guess, for the Carney government to adjust its course here, depending on what happens in the days and weeks ahead and whether we actually see any sort of meaningful steps. Are you still holding out hope maybe that this decision isn't cast in stone and maybe there's still an opportunity for Canada to adjust its position?
Well, given how quickly things changed over the last week with the statements that Mark Carney has made, there's always hope that he may readjust going into September. And I think that's a demand action that we'll be asking of our government to reconsider and take into account some of these facts and some of the ideas around what exactly it's going to take to recognize a state. What are the borders of this state? Who's the government that you're interacting with? How are we ensuring that it is demilitarized? So all of these things come to the fold.
It was interesting. They talked about it yesterday. The need to address the situation here at home and to respond to the very troubling upsurge of anti-Semitism we've seen in recent months over the last couple of years in Canada. What did you make of those commitments, and have we seen yet meaningful action, do you think?
I don't think we've seen enough meaningful action, is what I will say. And there's a normalization of anti-Semitism and of anti-Zionism that translates into anti-Semitism. It's very much part and parcel of the anti-Semitism we're seeing. That is that's dangerous, and that's becoming a problem not only for our community but for all Canadians. These are some shared democratic values that we have that are seeming to be eroding right now. And so we'd like to see some stronger action from friends, from allies, and from our government to counter this.
We'll see where this all goes from here. Much more is mentioned. JewishEdmonton.org. Stacey, thank you so much for making some time for us here today. Appreciate your input on this.
Thank you very much, Rob, for having me on.
All right. Again, that was Stacey Leavitt Wright, CEO of the Jewish Federation of Edmonton. So, look, there's the other factor here, the United States and Canada's relationship with the U.S. We don't necessarily have to see eye to eye with the United States on everything, including matters of foreign policy or Israel specifically. Now, this is what Mark Carney had to say on Wednesday when he was asked about whether he discussed Canada's decision with the U.S. prior to the announcement.
Look, the United States is the essential partner in peace in the Middle East, and in virtually in many parts of the world. And we've seen that demonstrated. First point. Second point is that the president does take a direct interest in resolving conflicts, and has with respect to a broader set of developments in the Middle East. And so again, the United States, this president will play and continue to play a central role.
Okay, and look, here's the thing. There are all sorts of indications that there are serious disagreements between Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu. Ultimately, as Carney has conceded, we need the United States engaged to try and get a resolution here. So maybe there was a way for Canada to approach it in that sense. Instead, we have a break here with the U.S., and it's where foreign policy is now strangely colliding with trade policy as Trump has dragged this issue into the trade talks. After Carney's announcement, Trump took to social media to declare, quote, "Wow, Canada has just announced that it is backing statehood for Palestine. That will make it very hard for us to make a trade deal with them, oh Canada," as in OH, Canada. I mean, it's odd that the two would be connected, and I mean, it doesn't appear that France or the UK will face similar trade consequences for their decisions to recognize a Palestinian state. Now, by the way, this is what Mark Carney had to say on Wednesday when he was asked about the state of trade talks with the U.S. ahead of August 1st.
Look, these are complex, they're comprehensive, they're constructive negotiations with the Americans are ongoing. It's possible that they may not conclude by the 1st of August, but we'll see. With the teams there, we're working hard. Conversations today, myself. So we'll see. There are, and the specific aspect of the question included a reference to the European Union deal, and could our accord with the United States include commitments on investments and other aspects? And I just observed that there are many areas for cooperation between Canada and the United States, including defense spending, security spending, investments, which is one of the reasons why we're having these broader discussions.
Okay, now we are recording this podcast late Thursday, so it's not quite August 1st, but there's a few things to mention here. It does not appear that a deal is imminent, and Trump is now talking about raising tariffs on Canada from 25% to 35%. Of course, that doesn't apply to trade that already falls under our existing free trade agreement with the U.S., so it's all a little confusing. And it looks like it's going to be pretty confusing for a lot of countries on Fridays. It sounds like all sorts of tariffs are going to be imposed to mark August 1st. Earlier on Thursday, though, White House spokesperson Carolyn Leavitt couldn't really explain how this was all going to work.
For the countries that don't have a deal yet, should we be looking at the April 2nd chart at all? Or is he negotiating and talking about having a set tariff rate, 10%, 20%?
Those discussions are taking place with the trade team today, and again, we'll provide further guidance with that executive order once it is signed, and the answer to that question will be in that executive order.
Now, one other thing to pay attention to is the court challenge that was being heard this week in the U.S. on Trump's tariff authority. The challenge argues that Trump's tariffs are an abuse of presidential authority under the Constitution, so some or all of these tariffs could be struck down. Trump has claimed emergency power to impose these tariffs, but what's the emergency? It's weird because otherwise the White House is running around boasting about how well the U.S. economy is doing, which sort of undercuts the economic emergency argument. So we'll see it all transpires on Friday and where this all goes from here. It's becoming increasingly hard to be optimistic about where things are at or where they're going, honestly, but I'll be happy to be proven wrong on that. Okay, still to come an update on the state of air passenger rights in Canada. Travelers are supposed to be protected under the air passenger protection regulations, but there's a massive backlog of complaints at the Canadian Transportation Agency. We'll speak with air passenger rights advocate Gabor Lukacs about how we ended up with such a mess and how we need to go about cleaning it up. That's next on the Rob Breakenridge Show. Welcome back. Well, just over 9 months after the Supreme Court of Canada upheld Canada's airline passenger protection rights, it seems as though the system may not be functioning as we need it to. There were new revelations this week about the backlog of complaints at the Canadian Transportation Agency, now numbering over 85,000. That speaks to a couple of things. A, the problems that persist in the system that are prompting so many complaints in the first place, and B, our inability to deal with these complaints in a reasonable time frame. Well, joining us now for more on all of this is someone who's been immersed in this issue for many years now. Dr. Gabor Lukacs is founder and president of Air Passenger Rights. More at airpassengerrights.ca. Gabor, great to have you with us here. Welcome to the program.
Hi, Rob. It's great to be with you.
So first of all, let's talk about why we're seeing such a large number. I mean, not just the backlog, what we'll get into, but that obviously implies that there's just a significant number of complaints in general. Why are we seeing so many complaints?
The reason that we see so many complaints is because currently it is more profitable for airlines to break the law, to not respect passenger rights, than to actually respect it. The reason that it is more profitable is because there are virtually no profit-altering consequences for an airline that refuses to pay compensation owed to passengers, even though Parliament did want to have consequences for airlines that engage in such unlawful behavior.
Well, I mentioned the fact that the airlines, they fought this in court. They lost at the Supreme Court of Canada. I think, for Canadians, the fact that this was a fight, that the airlines opposed this, I mean, that implied that this was some meaningful new protection that was coming into force. But why hasn't it worked out that way?
The main point of failure is the government failure to implement the actual essence of passenger protection. There are two prongs to this failure. One is how their passenger protection regulations are worded. They require so much unnecessary and disproportionate amount of evidence for an adjudicator to decide a fate of just $400 that it slows down the adjudication process. That is one cause for the massive backlog. It's 87,000 complaints at this point, and it is projected to swell to 126,000 complaints by 2028. The other part is that the airlines have a vested interest in breaking the system, and they have any financial interest at this point in obeying the law. Because the worst thing that can happen after 2 or 3 years of adjudication is that they have to pay what they were supposed to pay 3 years earlier, and quite possibly without having any interest on top of it. When you look at what Parliament intended to happen in practice, Parliament in 2023 ordered the government to introduce a cost recovery fee for each complaint that an airline generates. The airline should be bearing the cost of adjudicating that complaint. That was supposed to be put in place 2 years ago. The Canadian Transportation Agency promised a consultation in August 2023, which did not happen until much later in 2024, almost October, November 2024. And that consultation did happen. We critiqued what they were proposing in terms of amount and methodology. And still, it is not in place. So we're now 2 years from the date that Parliament told the government, you shall impose this cost recovery fee, and it is still not in place. The importance of the cost recovery fee would be that there would be some cost consequence for an airline to just tell the passenger, you know what, we won't pay you, go and complain to the CTA. Right, right now, there's none. There's only an advantage financially to an airline to force passengers to go that route, because perhaps the passenger will give up, perhaps the decision will go in their favor. But even in a situation when they clearly should know that they have no case, they just have a financial incentive because of the government's inaction to push passengers to file a complaint or sue in small claims court for that matter, instead of just settling things as reasonable businesses would do. That's reason number one. Reason number two, on the enforcement side, is that on top of the cost recovery fee, there are also fines available in the law to punish airlines that break the law. Parliament authorized the Canadian Transportation Agency 2 years ago to increase the maximum amount of fine that can be imposed per incident, per passenger, per violation for APPR violations to $250,000. But the Canadian Transportation Agency never implemented that. So the way it works is Parliament says you can increase your ceiling for the fines that you issue. And then the Canadian Transportation Agency has to make regulations which says, yes, we are going to issue such fines. That never happened for the past 2 years. And even currently where the ceiling is only $25,000, 10% of what it should be, the actual fines are being issued are ridiculous. They're 2.5% of the maximum amount. So if the maximum amount is $25,000 per violation, they will issue maybe $500 fine. That's really just pocket money for an airline.
I do wonder, you mentioned, the cost, the trouble of going through a complaint now with the backlog, the prospects for passengers of having to wait 2 years. Is all of this discouraging people from filing complaints in the first place?
That's what the airlines want to happen. And the problem is that the government is aiding and abetting in that malicious behavior of the airlines. From the airlines' perspective, from day one, it was clear they would try to sabotage the system. And one way to sabotage the system is trying to generate so many complaints that the system will break and say, look, you cannot even handle the complaints, so obviously the rules you put in place were wrong. What I would respond to that is that the point of failure here is the rules are not simple enough. That's one of the many reasons why we should adopt European Union's gold standard, where it just takes minutes to decide whether a passenger is owed compensation. Just look at public data. You don't see anything obvious. Compensation is owed. End of story. 5 minutes of adjudication, typically, most cases. And the other point of failure by design is lack of enforcement, lack of actual incentive for airlines to comply with the law.
Right. As you say, not every complaint is valid or will turn out to be valid, but there's a faster way of doing this. We see how this works elsewhere.
That's right. And obviously, no one would propose to hold the airline accountable or punish them for passengers filing frivolous complaints, and sometimes that happens too. What we were actually saying in the consultation is that for each complaint which is found to have some merit, the airline should be bearing the full cost of the adjudication of that complaint. And that would be a quite significant amount. We are talking about a cost of well over $1,000. If that were to happen, then airlines would have far more incentive to settle with passengers, to act like normal Canadian behavior would be. Canadians, as Canadians, we are quite compromise searching. We are conflict avoiding. And the problem is that the airlines, on the other hand, are taking advantage of us, and they are bullies. They act in a way that you wouldn't act to your neighbor. So that is why having some behavior modification would be vital from a governmental perspective to more create an equality of arms in a way, to more create incentive for airlines to act with the same type of goodwill, same kind of common sense, same type of conflict avoidance that average Canadian passenger would be acting.
So right now, if someone's looking at 2 years to have their complaint heard, and we've got this massive backlog that, as you say, is going to grow in the coming years, it seems like quite a task to fix this, right? So where do we even begin here?
From an individual passenger perspective, don't bother with the Canadian Transportation Agency. Not only do they have big backlog, they're also quite cozy with the airlines. So getting a fair hearing there is not always easy, and I wouldn't bet on that. I would take cases to small claims court, where a judge may agree or disagree with what you are presenting, but in general, you are going to get a fair hearing. Judges have no vested interest. They don't have an ongoing working relationship with the airlines. They just look at the case, look at the facts, look at the law, and make a decision in the best way they can. That's on the individual level. At a systemic level, there are 3 things we need to do. First, we should urgently revise the air passenger protection regulations to match the European Union's golden standard, where deciding the fate of a complaint, fate of a compensation takes only a couple of minutes. The work has already been done. We have already told the government what needs to be done. They just need to implement it. Second, the government should finally comply with what Parliament ordered the government to do, which is impose a cost recovery fee, even if the airline is kicking and screaming. That is going to be a second measure to ensure that going forward, airlines will want to settle more, as opposed to just fighting every complaint. And the third point is start fining airlines very significant amounts to the tune of millions of dollars like they do in the United States if they break the laws. Breaking the law should be a profit-altering behavior that could easily wipe out a whole quarter's profit for an airline. If the government was able and willing to do that, very quickly airlines would start behaving.
Is that enough of an incentive then, do you think, for the airlines to address these underlying issues, right? I mean, we're still seeing delays and cancellations that are causing all of these headaches and problems for passengers. How do we get the airlines to ensure that we don't have all these complaints in the first place?
That is a more challenging part. I mean, first of all, the airlines have to feel the full financial burden of having to pay those compensations. Once they have to pay those compensations, then it will be the airline's best interest to find some solutions to better organize themselves. Maybe to have more backup crew, have more backup aircraft, have mutual agreements to pick up backups for each other. But right now, the airlines don't face sufficient economic pressure to invest in improvements. There are also other issues that one should be talking about, such as, but that's not the airline's problem. There's NAV Canada being understaffed. These are issues, however, that I wouldn't expect to hold the airline accountable for unless they knew in advance about the problem and still book the flights. That's an ongoing problem by the airline industry, that they know about some systemic problems, which is not them generating the problem, but they know in advance an airport is going to have a runway shut down for innovation, and they still sell tickets from that airport. They don't do things that badly anymore, but still with NAV Canada and other issues which are known in advance, it's happening. And that's one more thing that should be curbed, again, with financial means. There's a lot of things to improve, no doubt, but a starting point for any improvement is to create financial incentive for airlines to improve things and invest in improvements. And that will happen only if the APPR is going to be revamped and enforced in a systemic, consistent, and unforgiving way.
We often hear from the airlines about the challenges they face, the financial challenges that they face, and it seems like lawmakers are often sympathetic to those arguments. What should Canadians make of those claims? How relevant is that to this whole situation?
I'm very skeptic about those type of arguments. Just look at Europe. They have low-cost carriers that are still able to remain profitable while they have to face the European Union's gold standard of passenger protection. That should give us a pause. Canada would need more competition. That's something what the Competition Bureau also found in a recent study. We don't have adequate competition in our domestic markets. So my thoughts on Canadian Airlines, if you don't want or cannot compete in a way that treats passengers fairly, get out of the business. Let somebody else run your business, sell your business. There are airlines that know and able to make both profit and treat passengers fairly. And we should not be sacrificing consumer protection on the altar of profits of some private companies. Don't like it, they should just take their money elsewhere.
In the meantime, if we don't change the status quo, we just keep going on as we are, where does that leave us, a year from now or 5 years from now?
We are going to see even more backlog systems. We are going to see more anarchy. It is already affecting tourism industry. When people choose staycation instead of vacation, the fact of how it has a kind of lack of accountability, unpredictability of the air travel is probably adding to that factor. Maybe not be the determinative factor in people's decision, but I'm sure it is adding there. So it is a vital interest of everybody in the travel industry in Canada to press this issue, to have airlines comply with the law, that travel should not be so painful. The travel should be a smooth experience. And yes, sometimes things go wrong, but then it would be an immediate apology with a check, making things right, which is that's how traditionally Canadians do things. I mean, just think of a simple example. You have a neighbor is a good neighbor, your good neighbor relationship. You have a cold day in the winter and your car just ends up rear-ending his car when you is about your parking. What would you do? You would immediately knock on the door. Sorry, Dave, I bumped your car. Here's my insurance card. Let me see how I can make it right for you. That's the behavior that I want airlines to do. And that would bring, on the longer run, far more prosperity, far more tourism, far more travelers, far more profit.
Let me just ask you this in closing, and maybe in a more glass half full kind of way. I mean, you've been working on this issue for so many years now. Are we better off today than we were 5 or 10 years ago with this focus on air passenger rights, with at least half measures or baby steps in this direction? Have you seen progress?
I would say that there's far more public awareness of this. This is remaining now far more in a public eye. Passengers are starting to realize and recognize that when they buy a ticket, it's a contract and they are entitled to get service for their hard-earned money. Mm-hmm. That idea of a more self-conscious, more aware of your rights consumer community, of passenger community, has improved a lot. There's still a lot of work ahead. Of course, my dream is to make myself obsolete. I would love to see a Canada where we just once a year hear about one thing going wrong, but generally airlines are behaving and focusing on providing good service. I would say that I would want airlines to become as consumer friendly as, say, IKEA would be today. IKEA wasn't that nice all the time in Canada either, but the idea of IKEA is, as I'm seeing them, is that they want the passenger, the consumer, to come back for another shopping trip and buy their next furniture there. That's what Canadian Airlines should also be thinking, and that type of customer relations and keeping the customer reasonably happy attitude would go a long way.
All right, much more as mentioned, airpassengerrights.ca. Gabor, thank you so much for making some time for us here. Appreciate this.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, again, that was Dr. Gabor Lukacs. He is founder and president of Air Passenger Rights, more at airpassengerrights.ca. Listen, that's going to do it for this edition of the Rob Breakenridge Show as we head into the August long weekend. With Monday being a holiday, there won't be a new episode of this show on Tuesday. We'll be back next Friday, August 8th. However, there will be a new episode of the Line Alberta podcast dropping on Wednesday, hosted by yours truly. We had a really interesting launch this week. You can check out the first episode at alberta.readtheline.ca. Now, one of the things we've been talking about, and something I think people are genuinely interested in, is the whole issue of Alberta separation. Like, where's this push coming from? Why are so many Albertans, it seems, pushing to break away from Canada? We'll bring you that perspective again this coming Wednesday, August 6th, on the Line Alberta podcast. In the meantime, more at my Substack, robbreakenridge.ca. You can find this podcast at our website, also on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music. We also have a YouTube channel. You can find that at Rob Breakenridge Show. Have yourselves a safe and enjoyable August long weekend, folks. My name is Rob Breakenridge. We'll talk to you next week. Take care.